Hello and welcome to the last video in this series. So in this video we're going to be talking about performance scaling for our reflection captures using the more advanced material system. So there's no secret, the reflection capture is going to be pretty costly as far as rendering time, but there's a couple ways around this which we can use to decrease our milliseconds between frames and basically give you a balance between rendering quality and performance. So a couple things that we have to change outside of the editor, actually just one for now, is something called Hzb Occlusion. So you would do this in your console variables. That would be under your engine and then config and then console variables. You double click on that real quick and that'll bring you up here. And then I have this line right here, r.hzb occlusion set to 0. So Hzb occlusion is a culling of occlusion. So basically it's disabling occlusion behind objects in the scene. And when you're using a render cube, which is rendering in 6 different directions, it's very costly because it's doing 6 different textures, all stitched together basically. And then each one of those has its own render tree. So Hzb is being applied 7 times throughout your scene, so for the cube and then also your actual camera. So disabling it will increase your performance by a huge margin. So disabling that, you just type this in and then you hit save and restart your editor. And then there's a couple other limitations with the system that you have to choose to disable or enable. The big one right now is right down here, motion blur. So motion blur on dynamic objects is a bit of a touchy subject right now. Unreal 4 is supporting it and continually improving it, but right now with the system, with motion blur enabled, dynamic materials with this system will look very, very, very blurry. And there's hopefully in the future going to be a way around this. I expect there will be, but right now we have to make sure that motion blur is disabled. So the next thing we want to do is consider using a different AA method. So that would be right here under miscellaneous AA. There's the 2 options that we have, temporal and FXAA. Temporal AA can give you some artifacts with PBR materials with high reflection, so low roughness values on dynamic objects. Basically what it gives you is ghosting. So you have to pick and choose between here. For now, I'll leave it to Temporal AA, but generally I like to switch to FXAA. Alright, so those are the things we have to set up before we even start playing around. The next thing is the actual cube map. So there is included, since 4.6, some new parameters which allow us to choose render functions. So if I double click on this render target, we can see that it's actually set to a really small scale right now, so I'll boost this up to 256, which would be on the kind of upper scale of your limitations. Obviously, as years go by, you'll be able to punch these numbers up much higher, but 256 is really good for 1080p gaming. So let's take a look at some of these parameters. In the general show, we have atmosphere, BSP, decals, fog, all this different kind of stuff that you can choose to either enable or disable. And every time you disable some, you start getting a faster render time. So generally, I don't include translucency. I don't include ambient occlusion, dynamic shadows. I like to keep skylighting on because that helps with some shadows, but it's up to you whether to turn this on or off. You'll see that deferred lighting changes the look of your surfaces quite a bit, or this render right here. But this is actually one of the biggest performance hits that I was getting in my own testing. So when I had deferred lighting on, I was getting around 75 frames per second. But when it was disabled, I was getting above 100. So of course, depending on your scene, this might change. In some of Epic's own games, I've run the system and deferred lighting didn't seem to make much of a difference, but that was one of the big ones in my own games. So generally I don't leave text on. And a couple other things, we can see that skylighting now has a big difference on what we're seeing. Ambient cube maps I typically don't use, so I turn them off. Distance field AO, light functions, shafts, reflection environments, screen space reflections, and IES textures, all disabled. Some other things you can think about is fog, decals, BSP generally I leave on because normally we have a lot of BSP brushes, atmosphere as well because that helps the sky, and one of the most important things in our reflections is the sky, so I like to give that priority. And the very last thing, which can change your performance in a massive way, is this max view distance override. So by default, this value is set to -1, which essentially says that this system is going to render everything in the scene no matter how far away it is. But you can also start playing around with this number to give yourself much better performance. So if I change this to 100 right now, we can see that 100 Unreal units is not giving you much to see. So let's punch in another 0. So this is now at 1,000. And in this tiny little scene, it's actually capturing everything here. So all these reflections would be seeing everything in the scene. And everything outside of it would not be rendered, which means it's saving you performance, it's saving you and giving you better frame rates. So this is one of the new ones that I really like to play around with. Definitely check it out when you're working on your own stuff. Depending on the scene, you might want mountains in the background, so you have to leave this on. But of course, it's all up to you whether you want the performance trade-offs or the visuals. And the last couple things is how to use this in your actual blueprints. So in my vehicle blueprints, I always include a scene capture cube. But at the time of this recording, 4.6, this is actually not possible because as soon as you insert one of these reflection captures, or scene captures rather, into a blueprint, you don't gain these parameters. And this is a bug which is being fixed in 4.7. But if you're using an older version of Unreal 4, you won't be given these options. So that's something to consider when considering upgrading your system. And that's basically pretty much it. Of course, I would definitely recommend playing around with the GPU profiling tools to take a look at the specifics of your capture in your scene. That's how I found my Hzb Occlusion problem. I'm going to be using this system in my own game, so I upgrade with every new iteration of Unreal 4, so I am constantly looking at new problems that crop up. So if you're having a problem and it's past February, look at the forums, see if I've included some updates. I'll include a link in the description in this video to find the most current data on what my performance is, and that way you guys can keep up to date and make sure you have the best looking reflections and the best performance. Alright, so that's going to be a wrap up on these videos. If you have specific questions or if you have ideas for improvements to the system, send me an email. My email is vincent.stimpson@gmail.com. I'm always willing to talk to you if you have ideas or if you're having problems. I'll help you walk through them. And yeah, I like to do as much as I can with anybody that uses the system, so don't be afraid to send me an email if you have some problems. Alright, so that's going to be it. Good luck and have a great time using this system. It's a lot of fun once you get past the learning wall.